And just like many economies across the continent are opening up after the pandemic, West Africa's second largest economy, Ghana, has announced the reopening of all sea and land borders. Now, during his 28th national COVID-19 update, Ghanaian President Nana Akufo-Addo announced an update on the measures taken to limit the spread of the virus. 2 years after the country closed all borders, the president says that the reopening of land and sea borders would help Ghana's economy soon rebound. Now, the economy is struggling to recover from the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and to bear the burden of its public debts, which is now about 80% of its GDP. Authorities are also worried about the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the global economy and its repercussions in Ghana. So today, we'll be focusing on Ghana reopening its borders amid its economic recovery drive. This is Business Edge. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. And joining me is Dr. Josh Bamfo. He's partner and head of transfer pricing and economic advisory services at Andersen, Nigeria. Josh, welcome back to the show once again. And I'll start it with saying a big congratulations to Ghana and the Black Stars for qualifying over Nigeria. So we'll keep it friendly today. All right?
Definitely.
All right. So let's start with this. We've seen that Ghana's borders have been closed for the past 2 years. And this was a bid to really curb the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's nothing that anyone else has now done. But there were definitely massive repercussions for the economy. So take us through the effects of closing the land and sea borders for Ghana in particular.
All right. Thank you, Tolulope, for having me. So clearly, we all recall 2020 and the challenges we all faced because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Government had a challenge of balancing, saving lives with, saving livelihoods. So it was always, an issue of, do I come up with some kind of mitigating, restrictions to help curb the pandemic, which then also has adverse impact on the economy. So over time, it's been a case whereby once we see that the health situation is getting better, then we make some kind of calculated decision to lift some of these restrictions.
All right, so some network connection issues there, but my guest first quickly taking us through the effects of the border closures, that's the land and sea borders, of course, that Ghana did for the past 2 years. And as I said earlier, this is nothing new. It's not different. We've had a conversation in recent times as to other countries as well reopening their borders after the closure because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're still in the midst of the pandemic. We've seen a resurgence in many areas, and that's one of the places I want to, of course, touch on today. So let me see if Dr. Bamfo is back. Dr. Bamfo, are you back with me?
I am.
All right.
I didn't know that I lost you. Okay.
No problem. Okay, so you were just quickly taking us through some of the effects of the border closure.
Yeah. So clearly, once they lifted the, travel, what was left was both land and by sea. In terms of land, the challenge has always been there are multiple entries into the country by land. On the east, you have the Aflawo border, which is very active between Togo and Ghana. On the west, you have you look at Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, and the north is Burkina Faso and Ghana. So what was important was how do we ensure that by the time we lift the land border restriction, we don't, escalate the importation of COVID viruses back into the country. I think we've gotten to a point where government believes strongly that we have enough evidence that, we have to under control on the health side, even though one of the major consideration was the fact that now we have people being fully vaccinated. But even with that, the vaccination rate is not that impressive. It's 16%.
Yes.
But the fact that new cases are relatively low gave the government that confidence that they could actually lift that ban and to ensure that we have, a resurgence of economic activities, especially in the local economies around those borders. And I think that is what the government has done. And I think it's timely because you need to manage the two, the health implications of the lifting of those bans and ensuring that we have a resurgence of economic activities, at least in those local economies along the borders.
And I like what you said earlier, that we all found ourselves in a fight to save lives also versus saving livelihoods. And particularly for the continent with very large informal sectors around so many different economies, it was a massive thing. So what support, if any, then did some of Ghana's hardest hit sectors get, even particularly the informal sector? So as you mentioned, the traders that were particularly hit with the land border closures, was government able to effectively give them some form of support to get them through the past 2 years?
Yeah, I think at the peak of COVID-19, government actually had a number of social intervention programs. We know that some of the major costs to individuals and small businesses is in the area of having access to electricity or power, yes, and also have access to water. So those were areas that the government actually intervened. And for months, individuals and small businesses, they have to pay for such. All these had an implication for our budget because this were unintended or unplanned expenditures that government had to, take up because it was necessary to save both lives and livelihoods. So those were some of the broad policies in terms of intervention measures that were implemented across board, not just specific to those land border economies. On top of my head, I don't know of specific ones targeted to those particular economies, but there were broad measures that individuals and small businesses could actually take advantage of, which those economies along the borders could also take advantage of
as well. All right, so we've heard and the officials there estimate that about 50% of the GDP of West African states, around $50 billion, was lost between 2020 and 2021. Are we able to put some figures now? Are we getting some figures and some data coming out from Ghana in specific terms as to what the Ghanaian economy has lost?
I don't know on top of my head whether they've been able to put a figure, but I can explain that, look, the impact has been massive. And I don't think that it's going to be an easy task to put a figure on it. Because if you were to put a figure, there are two ways you can look at it. If you look at it purely from an accounting point of view, you're going to look at what are some of the direct costs, that has been incurred by the economy due to the pandemic. But if you look at it from a purely economic point of view, it's a combination of the direct cost and the opportunity cost of, the pandemic. And why am I saying this? Just to put it in perspective. One of the direct costs would be clearly the fact that there were unintended or unplanned expenditures that the government had to embark on because of the pandemic. One, to contain the spread of the virus, and two, to support individuals and small businesses in order to stay afloat. So those direct costs, I believe they can actually look at them and come up with a number. However, there are also the opportunity costs. There are a number of projects that should have been embarked on based on the budget that because of the pandemic, we did not actually embark on. Those capital projects could have then generated, some level of economic activity, including domestic and foreign direct investments. That never happened. All right. So this is something that you give up because of the pandemic. That's an opportunity cost that will also have to be quantified if you really want to know the economic impact of this particular pandemic from an adverse impact point of view. So I'm yet to see what those actual numbers will come up. But if you look at what we are going through as a nation right now from an economic point of view, it's very clear in terms of the challenges that we've gone through because of the pandemic. This was an economy that was one of the rising stars across Africa prior to the pandemic. For 2017, 18, and 2019, the economy had consistently grown on an average of almost 7%. In 2020, year of the pandemic, it grows by 0.41%, right? That clearly shows one of the costs in terms of the level of economic activity. 2021, we've been trying to bounce back, I think around 4.71%. But this is just to get back to pre-pandemic periods. So the economy has actually been set back. And this is just on the economic activity side of things. We've seen the inflation rate. This was an inflation rate that was brought from 19% from the previous government to as low as below 10%. We got to single digit, which is within the 8% plus or minus 2% range of the Central Bank of Nigeria. Today, if you look at the impact of the Ukraine crisis and all that, it's somewhere around 50.7%. Wow. So we see the adverse impact hitting the economy in so many areas. The debt crisis, prior to the pandemic, we had debt to GDP ratio around 62%. Post-pandemic, now we are somewhere around 80%. That is another huge adverse impact or cost to the economy due to the pandemic. So in any parameter that you pick up, any macroeconomic parameter, you are able to see the adverse impact of this pandemic on the economy. So I think it's very huge. And I think they can actually come up with some quantification. I don't know that on top of my head. And
I'm happy you bring up the debt to GDP conversation, because right now it's almost difficult to have any economic conversation about any African economy without the issue of debt coming up. And as you said, it's standing around 80% right now. And some estimates said it will trend over around 74% for 2022 and then dip again into about 70% for 2023 for Ghana. But when you look at that, do you think the diversion of funds to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, to sort of get the economy through, is enough to actually really account for almost 10 digits increase from where Ghana was before with their debt to GDP ratio to now, or even over 10%, now getting to this 80% range? Is the pandemic in almost 2 years enough to account for the increase in the debt to GDP ratio we've seen for Ghana?
So it's a combination of factors, with the pandemic being the major factor.
Okay.
Remember, around that time, the government believed in a cleanup of the financial service sector because they believed strongly that if they were to embark on the ambitious industrialization program that they had, called the One District, One Factory, amongst other flagship policies, they needed to make sure that the financial sector was robust enough and those banks had the appropriate amount of assets to be able to actually support this industrialization drive. That in itself led to a financial service cleanup that was highly costly. So also the energy sector cleanup that was highly costly. You combine these two, which can be argued to be extraordinary items because these are not routine year-to-year expenditures, to the significant amount of expenditures that were unintended but spent on due to COVID. And the fact that you also lost some revenues that you plan to have received but for the pandemic, because what happened was, with the economic activities grinding to a halt, businesses were going to run into losses. People were going to be laid off. So you are not going to be getting the kind of tax revenues from those sources that hitherto you would have gotten. So all this led to the ratcheting up of the budget deficit, which you need to finance through borrowing. So clearly, the pandemic is at the heart of the debt to GDP ratio going up. Remember, the debt to GDP ratio is made out of two components. The numerator is the debt stock. That went up significantly. Then denominator is your GDP. That didn't grow at all. It dropped from 6% to 0.4. So if you have your numerator going up and without your denominator increasing, then that debt to GDP ratio clearly is going to go up significantly.
All right. So Josh, I want you to hold the line. So now the borders are reopened. Who's going to quickly benefit from the reopening? How will the economy feel the impact? And then we have to talk about, of course, Easter holidays coming up. There's going to be a significant test to governments reopening and loosening restrictions. Is Ghana ready for this? So we'll take that up when we come back from the break, and then also touch on the controversial Elevy very quickly that was passed by the Ghanaian parliament just recently. Criticism has trailed the passing of that. We know opposition parties actually walked out of the debate, but now it is law, 1.5%. We'll get into the details after this. So with me is Dr. Josh Bamfo, partner and head of transfer pricing and economic advisory services at Andersen, Nigeria, as we take a look at Ghana reopening its borders amid the country's economic recovery drive. So Dr. Bamfo, my next question now goes to who's going to quickly benefit? We've talked about this, of course, in terms of the border communities and the informal economy, but who else? Who's going to quickly benefit from the borders reopening? And how quickly do you think the Ghanaian economy will see the impact of these reopened borders?
Yeah, I think the obvious immediate beneficiaries are going to be the local economies along the borders. So if you look at Aflawo, for example, there's a lot of traffic in terms of people going in and out of Ghana and Togo prior to the pandemic. A lot of Ghanaians, might go to Togo, buy stuff, bring them in to sell, and vice versa. Some people even provide services across those borders. Same can be said for Ilobo and Cote d'Ivoire, and same can be said for those in the upper regions and Burkina Faso. So those local economies are definitely going to benefit significantly from, the lifting of this particular ban. And I think that's welcoming news because obviously it had an adverse impact on them. In terms of the indirect impact, the larger economy is also going to benefit because at the end of the day, there's always been a lot of activities across its borders, and that actually helps the economy as a whole. So my expectation is that first and foremost, the immediate impact is going to be the local economies along the borders, and it's going to gradually affect the economy as a whole. And because one of our biggest objectives prior to this pandemic was actually to increase intra-African trade. And even before we had the African Free Trade Continental Agreement, we've always had a lot of activities across our borders with our neighboring countries. So this is actually in line with the general policy of increasing, intra-African trade. And I think that, the local economies will benefit, and the economy as a whole will also benefit.
So this is coming in the midst of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. And as you mentioned earlier, that has also unfortunately pushed up inflation in Ghana. We've seen the effects of the crisis across the continent with the wheat prices, grains, as well as fuel prices also hitting very hard. But particularly for Ghana, beyond the inflationary increase and the pressure coming, what else has been the impact of this Ukraine-Russia crisis? And are there plans? What is the go-between or the go-around that the administration of President Nana Akufo-Addo is working on in the interim?
So clearly, after the pandemic, I think everybody thought that the whole challenge would be, hey, how do we speed up the economy in terms of stimulating economic activities, create more jobs, and get people back to living the way they used to live, or even better going forward. I don't think that anybody anticipated that there was going to be another major external shock like Russia invading Ukraine, and Russia being a major exporter of oil, leading to significant supply disruptions and all this kind of stuff, leading to fuel prices going up and therefore inflation going up. So this is a whole new dynamic that I think the government of Ghana and other African economies will have to deal with. So for me, the way I see the management of the economy today, it's like driving a car, right? If you have the highway and there's no traffic, you speed up the economic activities in order to create more jobs. But, if there's some unanticipated intervention, external shocks such as the Ukraine crisis, then you might have to slow down the economic activities and then deal with the inflation situation. And that's what we are seeing today. So what has happened is that oil prices have gone up. We've seen inflation rate increase significantly to 15.7% in Ghana. Government has recognized the need. They've sat down and recognized the need to try to bring, some of the taxes on fuel, products down, so that, the price at the pump also goes down a little bit. This is a measure to help individuals and businesses. We've also seen the Central Bank of, the Central Bank of Ghana called Bank of Ghana, meet, and the Monetary Policy Committee has clearly indicated they need to curb inflation now as an immediate concern. So what we've seen is that the monetary policy rate has been increased, I think from almost 14.5 to 17%, which means that they are implementing a contractional monetary policy to curb down on aggregate demand and therefore curb the inflation rate down. So all these activities are going on in order to deal with the unanticipated adverse impact of the Ukraine crisis. And once they deal with that, they can go back to stimulating the economy in terms of economic activities, which actually requires interest rates to rather go down and for spending of government to go up in terms of capital projects to stimulate the economy. So it's going to be a balancing act, you understand me? Because nobody really anticipated inflation to become a major problem at this point when the pandemic actually led to a contraction of economic activities. So now you have the two evils, inflation and economic activities being down to deal with. And you need to pick your poison, because the measures to deal with inflation sometimes can worsen your ability to stimulate the economy.
And it leads me to my next question. So the Ghanaian Parliament has passed this controversial Elevy, which introduces a 1.5% tax on electronic money transfers and transactions. Now, the government is saying that this is going to help address a lot of problems like inflation, public debt, and unemployment. But critics are saying that at this point in time, coming out of the pandemic, facing the Ukraine-Russia crisis, this is simply not the way to go, and it simply adds another burden on Ghanaians who are already struggling with high living costs and things like that. Where do you stand on this?
So I think my position has been pretty consistent. I understand the sentiments of the average Ghanaian citizen, because we are going through tough times. And when we are going through tough times, you don't want additional costs, so that is very clear. But that said, the Ghanaian economy is in a very tough situation right now. And there's a need for all of us to actually make a bit of sacrifices to get us out of it. There's clear evidence that the current government has done a good job from the very beginning when they came into office in 2017. And they've been able to manage the economy very well in the first 3 years of their tenure. However, pandemic has thrown a whole new challenge. Ukraine crisis has thrown a whole new challenge, and we really need to come together and deal with this. The clear reason is this. Look, our debt situation was already a power situation, which got worse due to pandemic. Today, you cannot go to the international markets and borrow in order to finance your deficits. So what should happen is that your revenue should be pretty close to your expenditure. Unfortunately, a significant portion of our expenditures are on things that we cannot do much about. That is, servicing our debt, which is huge, which has become our number one expenditure item. Paying our people in the public service sector, which we can't do anything about it because you don't want their livelihood to be, curtailed. No, even before you can come in there's tax prepayment, before you can come to up projects that are necessary for the stimulation of the economy. So we really need to be creative in terms of generating additional revenue. And the Elevy was one of such revenue items to help us ensure that we either don't go to IMF, which would then lead to conditionalities, which are typically anti-growth. So I think the challenge was the ability for the government to actually articulate this to the public, for them to understand that, look, we all have to have our skin in the game by taking on a bit of some of these challenges. And I think government has done a little bit of that. They've cut about 20% of some of the expenditures. They've laid embargoes on some kind of travels by government officials. And they are actually showing some kind of goodwill in the sense that, look, we are all in this. Everybody has to pay a bit of their own, coffers to actually bring the economy back on track. And I believe that over time, if the Elevy, along with other revenues, are put to good use, and the economy gets back on track like pre-pandemic period, where we're growing around 7% on the average, then people will realize that this sacrifice was worth it. But if we are not able to put it in good use, then really people are going to look back and say, hey, we'll have some decisions to make come the next election period. So it's all up to the government to make the best out of this Elevy. And if you're able to do that, maybe you'll be able to justify why it was a necessary evil.
All right. And we'll be watching very closely. I know what was proposed is actually not what was actually signed eventually. The proposed percentage was actually higher. And government has also actually cut wages. We heard President Akufo-Addo also at least reducing some of the wages for him and his cabinet. So there is, as you said, some moves being shown to the Ghanaian public. But we're watching how to see how things develop. West Africa's second largest economy, very fantastically driven and moving before the pandemic. So for Ghana to get back to those levels, it benefits all of us here on the West African region. Dr. Josh Bamfo, thank you as always for joining me.
Thank you very much, Tolulope.
All right. And you still owe me a bottle of wine. I know he heard me on that to console my spirits and those of my team here in Nigeria. If you don't know, Nigeria lost to the Black Stars of Ghana. So please, we'll be expecting our consolation prize.
Definitely, we'll do that.
Thank you so much. And it is also interesting to note that in the midst of all of this, we're keeping our eyes on Shanghai. And that's important. Shanghai is the business district of China and is currently under lockdown because of resurgence of COVID-19. So how does that link to Ghana? Easter holidays are coming up. And many people believe that the government's decision to reopen the land and the sea borders and also ease the restrictions caused by COVID-19 will be put to the test with the movement of people and the movement of people with the holidays. But as they say, hindsight is 20/20, and we won't know if this decision was the best one until after the holidays and the numbers come in. 13% of Ghana's population is now double vaccinated against COVID-19, while only 13 million people have received single doses of the COVID-19 vaccines. This is Business Edge. Up next is NC4 to watch. And for us to get into these stories, we're starting nowhere else but Ghana with a bit more information for you on the e-levy that was recently passed. Now, the Ghanaian Parliament approved the new electronic transaction tax, which the government says will help raise some $900 million in much needed revenue, but also, of course, sparked widespread controversy, criticism, and even protest. The president and his ministers also recently cut their own wages by 30%, along with other measures they hope will generate $400 million in savings for state coffers. The European Union is lending Tunisia 450 million euros, which includes 300 million euros allocated last year. Credit rating agency Fitch this month downgraded Tunisian sovereign debt to junk status, and investment bank Morgan Stanley said it expected the government to default on loans. Egypt, often the world's biggest wheat importer, is reeling from the surge in bread and flour prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine closed off access to lower-priced Black Sea wheat. Although Egypt has been a traditional buyer of Russian and Ukrainian wheat, India is willing to help Cairo by supplying the grain. Now, Egypt could buy up to 12 million tons of Indian wheat if all things go according to plan. And finally, flows to Germany through Nord Stream 1 pipeline across the Baltic Sea were over 70 million kilowatt hours per hour on Wednesday morning, slightly down from levels of around 73 million over the past 24 hours. However, the current drop is in line with nominations, which suggests a rebound could happen later today. And that, of course, comes as we are looking at what the talks between Russia and Ukraine will bring. We'll have all the latest for you at the top of the 12 o'clock hour West African time right here on News Central, when News Central Now comes your way. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Don't forget to follow us on social media, download our mobile app, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and stay with us 24 hours a day, where we put Africa first.